140 Iranian military targets, one night, gone. Not degraded, not damaged. Eliminated. Missile sites that took years to construct, naval assets that took billions to acquire, ammunition depots storing the inventory the IRGC has been drawing down through weeks of retaliatory launches, coastal surveillance grids that were the eyes of the entire Iranian maritime harassment operation in the world's most strategically important waterway. All of them, one by one, systematically taken offline in a single operational window while Iran's chief negotiator was typing a social media post, telling the world that the era of one-sided deals was over. He meant it as a warning. He got the direction exactly backwards. Because while Kalibaf was composing that message, CENTCOM was already pressing execute on Strike Package 3. The era of one-sided deals was indeed over, just not in the way he meant. But here is what most people missed. The 140 targets on Night 3 were not a peak. They were an escalation point in a sequence. And understanding the sequence, the specific order of events that produced 3 consecutive nights of precision American air power, hitting more targets each successive night, is the difference between watching this conflict and actually understanding it. Because this did not begin with an airstrike, it began with a ship on fire. Let's back all the way up, because to understand why CENTCOM's response was structured the way it was, why 3 nights of ascending strikes produced more than 300 confirmed destroyed Iranian military targets, while 800 commercial vessels continued moving through a waterway Iran had just declared closed, you need to understand what triggered it, who made the decisions that made it inevitable, and why the sequence that preceded the first bomb dropping reveals everything about the strategic logic operating behind all of it. The Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding gave Iran something that adversaries of the United States rarely receive in the middle of a live military confrontation: a documented off-ramp, a formal agreement with a single achievable condition attached to it. Not disarmament, not regime change, not the surrender of nuclear ambitions, or the dismantlement of the proxy network that has been projecting Iranian power across the Middle East for 4 decades. The condition was 60 days, 60 consecutive days of not attacking commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz. That is what the Islamic Republic of Iran agreed to. And then the IRGC set a ship on fire. The Cyprus-flagged container ship GFS Galaxy was transiting the strait on a routine commercial voyage. The crew were civilian mariners doing what civilian mariners have done in that waterway for centuries, moving cargo through an international passage that international maritime law guarantees the right of innocent transit through, regardless of which nation's coastlines it runs between. The IRGC attacked the vessel. Significant engine room damage, the crew forced to abandon ship. 1 crew member still missing in the aftermath. And then, in the single most revealing moment of the IRGC's relationship with operational reality, the organization simultaneously framed its attack as a service. A Shahed drone through the bridge of a civilian cargo ship was, in the IRGC's framing, maritime safety enforcement. Navigation assistance delivered via explosive warhead. This is what the organization signed the Memorandum of Understanding and then immediately began doing. Then came the declaration. The IRGC formally announced the Strait of Hormuz closed. No foreign vessel could transit without being identified, tracked, and monitored by Iranian forces. A second vessel was stopped dead in the water by what the IRGC described as a warning shot. Iran's naval commander stated on state-owned media that no foreign vessel could pass without Iranian authorization. The Islamic Republic was claiming sovereign operational control over 20% of the world's daily oil supply. A toll booth on the most economically consequential choke point on Earth, backed by military force and anchored in a legal theory built on creative reinterpretation of the agreement Iran had just signed and just violated. CENTCOM's response to this declaration was 7 words. 4 of them were, Iran does not control. 3 more, traffic is flowing. Then they launched Strike Package 1. Night 1 was approximately 80 targets. Not a punitive raid designed to send a message and create space for diplomatic de-escalation. A coordinated multi-axis precision strike package executing against the first tier of the target set that CENTCOM had been developing, refining, and positioning assets to execute against for weeks before the first bomb fell. The opening tier was the coastal surveillance infrastructure, the radar installations, the electronic warfare systems, the antenna arrays and monitoring facilities that give the IRGC the ability to find, identify, track, and threaten commercial vessels transiting the strait. The operational logic is straightforward and devastating. You cannot threaten what you cannot see. Remove the surveillance architecture first, and everything the IRGC does in the maritime harassment domain becomes operationally blind. Night 1 took away the eyes. The Jask Naval Base is worth examining specifically because its physical infrastructure, visible in commercial satellite imagery of the facility, tells the story of exactly what the IRGC has invested in to make the Strait of Hormuz work as a coercive instrument. Massive antenna arrays oriented directly toward the choke point. radar dishes of a scale that cast shadows visible from orbit, electronic warfare, and early warning radar installations that give IRGC naval commanders real-time awareness of every vessel transiting the waterway, its identity, its flag, its cargo, its course, its speed. Communications towers that provide the link between the surveillance picture and the command authority that decides which vessels to threaten, which to target, and when to act. Multi-use facilities that support both drone control and maritime targeting functions simultaneously. This is not a military base that happens to be near the Strait. This is a facility that was built specifically to weaponize the Strait, to give the IRGC the surveillance, targeting, communications, and command infrastructure required to make the threat of harassment operationally credible rather than rhetorically empty. Destroying Jask does not just eliminate a military installation. It removes the operational architecture that turned a geographic position on a map into a coercive instrument capable of holding the global energy supply hostage. Night 2 expanded to approximately 90 targets. The campaign broadened beyond coastal surveillance into the second tier: missile launch sites, naval capabilities, drone storage and launch infrastructure, additional communications relays, radar installations across a wider geographic footprint. Each target category in Night 2 builds on the degradation achieved in Night 1. Once the surveillance infrastructure is gone, the launch sites that depended on that surveillance for targeting data become less effective even before they are destroyed. But CENTCOM destroyed them anyway, because a launch site that cannot see its targets is still a launch site that can fire indiscriminately. An indiscriminate fire in the Strait of Hormuz means civilian mariners at risk, regardless of the IRGC's targeting accuracy. The second night removed the weapons. Night 3 delivered 140 targets. This is the number that defines the entire campaign's strategic ambition. The full menu, as the operational description characterized it: missile and drone launch sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage facilities, communication networks, and coastal surveillance locations, all addressed simultaneously in a single operational window. Not sequentially, simultaneously. For 140 geographically distributed targets to go dark in a single night, the American strike architecture above Iran's entire coastal military zone has to own that airspace completely from the first second of the operation. Every surviving Iranian radar that illuminates to track incoming strike aircraft becomes a beacon for harm missiles from F-16 Wild Weasels that have been specifically loaded and positioned for exactly that engagement. Every communications node that transmits becomes a detectable emission source that directs precision munitions to its location. The suppression of enemy air defenses and the active strike operations are not sequential steps in the night's package. They happen simultaneously, with each component enabling and multiplying the effectiveness of the others. The weapons deployed across 3 nights represent a complete integration of American strike capability across multiple domains and multiple platform categories. F-35, Lightning IIs as the door kickers, the stealth penetrators that enter the defended airspace first, using their low radar cross-section, and advanced electronic warfare suite to suppress the threat environment before the larger strike packages follow. F/A-18 Super Hornets launching off carrier decks in full afterburner on nighttime sorties, delivering precision munitions to targets that the F-35's earlier passes have sanitized of active defense. F-16 CJ Wild Weasel aircraft with HARM missiles hunting radar missions across the target area, making the act of turning on a radar system suicidal for any surviving Iranian air defense element. The GBU-54 Laser JDAM on F-16 strike packages deserves specific attention because its dual-mode guidance capability reveals the operational sophistication of the weapon selection. A conventional laser-guided bomb loses guidance if the delivering aircraft executes a threat reaction that breaks laser lock. The GBU-54 guides to the last known GPS coordinates of where the laser was pointing, then reacquires with laser guidance when the designator comes back online. In a combat environment where delivering aircraft might simultaneously be attacking a target and defending against a surviving Iranian surface-to-air system, this dual-mode capability is the difference between hitting the target and missing it under exactly the conditions most likely to stress the guidance system. CENTCOM did not load those weapons by accident. They loaded them because they expected threat reaction scenarios and wanted their pilots to hit the target regardless. Vertical launch system missiles from American destroyers add the naval fires dimension that makes the defensive problem for the IRGC genuinely multi-directional. Strike packages arriving from overhead are not the only threat that surviving Iranian command authorities are trying to process and respond to. Precision cruise missiles arriving from the sea surface add a second vector that approaches from a completely different direction at a different altitude profile with different radar signatures. When you are absorbing simultaneous air-delivered precision strikes and sea-launched cruise missiles, with degraded communications infrastructure and degraded radar capability and degraded command coherence, the defensive task becomes computationally impossible with the tools available. That is not an accident of planning. It is the intent of the campaign architecture. The result across 3 nights More than 300 confirmed Iranian military targets destroyed. 800 commercial vessels continued moving through the supposedly closed strait during the same operational period. 400 million barrels of crude oil transited a waterway that the IRGC had formally declared under Iranian sovereign control. The gap between what Iran claimed and what the operational reality demonstrated is not a negotiating margin. It is the entire distance between Iran's stated strategic position and the military capacity required to enforce it. Now look at the C-802 anti-ship cruise missile specifically, because it represents the most credible remaining Iranian capability against commercial vessels and naval assets in the Gulf, and it has not received the analytical attention it deserves in the mainstream coverage of this conflict. The C-802 is a Chinese-derived subsonic anti-ship weapon, a reverse-engineered derivative of the French Exocet, with a range exceeding 100 nautical miles and a sea-skimming terminal flight profile designed to defeat ship-based radar by approaching at extremely low altitude below the radar horizon before terminal acquisition. The IRGC has invested in this system specifically because its long-range and low-altitude approach profile provide a genuine capability to threaten commercial vessels and surface combatants operating in the Gulf from coastal positions that are not adjacent to the vessels being targeted. The American strike packages have been specifically targeting the coastal launch infrastructure, the targeting systems, and the communications architecture that makes C-802 employment operational. Destroying the radar networks that provide over-the-horizon targeting data for the C-802 is not just eliminating a surveillance asset. It is eliminating the sensor that makes the C-802 accurate enough to threaten a specific vessel rather than a vague direction of ocean. Russia's doorbell camera operation is the intelligence development that no one is connecting to the Iran campaign correctly, and the connection matters enormously for understanding the full scope of the information warfare dimension of this conflict. Dutch domestic and military intelligence agencies exposed a Kremlin-affiliated hacking campaign that compromised civilian internet-connected cameras, doorbell cameras, home security systems, and intercom units positioned along NATO military transport routes in the Netherlands and other European member states. The objective was real-time ground surveillance of weapons systems moving toward Ukraine. No satellites, no drones. A $40 Amazon device running factory default passwords, with a Russian intelligence operator accessing the video feed from the same smartphone application that the homeowner uses to see who is at the front door. Dutch intelligence specifically noted the technique is operationally similar to the method that Western intelligence services use to achieve persistent surveillance of the former Iranian supreme leader in the period before the strikes that opened this conflict. The same concept. Civilian-grade internet-connected devices positioned in relevant geographic locations, providing continuous visual intelligence at a cost that is a fraction of what any dedicated surveillance platform requires. The implications for operational security in any environment saturated with civilian internet-connected devices, which describes every urban and suburban environment in the developed world, are not theoretical. They are active. The $40 camera on your neighbor's doorstep is already being evaluated by every intelligence service in the world for exactly the application that Russian intelligence operationalized in the Netherlands. Iran's negotiating position is structurally broken in a way that the diplomatic framing of this conflict has been reluctant to state directly. The Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding was not violated accidentally. It was not violated because of a miscommunication within the IRGC's command structure. It was violated deliberately and almost immediately as a test of American resolve, a calculated probe to determine whether the United States would enforce the terms it had agreed to, or whether it would tolerate violations to preserve the diplomatic framework. The answer to that test was 300 confirmed destroyed Iranian military targets in 3 nights. And here is the part of the negotiating architecture that the public diplomatic discussion continues to underweight. An adversary that cannot honor a 60-day commitment to not attack unarmed civilian ships cannot be offered a longer diplomatic runway and be expected to use it differently. An adversary whose chief negotiator posts the text of an agreement to his organization is actively violating as evidence of good faith has demonstrated a relationship to the negotiating framework that makes additional framework agreements structurally unreliable regardless of their specific terms. The campaign that has destroyed 300 military targets in 72 hours is not creating leverage for a negotiated settlement. It is creating the conditions in which the physical infrastructure required to resume the behavior that triggered the campaign simply no longer exists. The mine threat in the Strait is the one asymmetric capability the IRGC retains that the air campaign cannot neutralize from altitude, with precision air-delivered munitions. Approximately 80 mines reported planted in the waterway represent a passive threat that does not require communications, does not require command authorization in real time, and cannot be eliminated by destroying the launcher that placed it, because the mine and the vessel that laid it are no longer in the same place. Mine countermeasure operations require specialized platforms, systematic survey operations, remotely operated vehicles, and the time and patience to clear each section of the waterway methodically before commercial traffic can safely resume. 300 radar sites going dark does not detonate a single mine. 800 ships moving through the strait during the 3-night strike campaign does not mean those ships transited without any mine threat. It means the mine threat was managed through route selection, minesweeper coordination, and the risk acceptance that accompanies any military operation in a contested maritime environment. Fully clearing the Strait of mines after the campaign achieves its terminal objectives will require weeks of dedicated MCM operations in conditions that are far more benign than the current combat environment. That is not a failure of the campaign. It is the residual problem that every campaign creates when it goes up against an adversary that used the pre-conflict period to prepare exactly the kind of passive asymmetric capability that survives the kinetic phase. The 3 simultaneous pressure tracks that have been operating against the Islamic Republic across the duration of this campaign have reached levels of simultaneous intensity that the available evidence suggests the Iranian leadership did not fully model before making the decisions that triggered the current phase of conflict. The military track has established effective air superiority over Iran's entire coastal zone and is operating at a tempo and a target count that has no precedent in the history of U.S.-Iran military confrontation. The suppression of Iranian air defense capability has been so comprehensive that American aircraft are executing nighttime and early morning strike sorties over Iranian territory with the operational freedom and the mission planning confidence of aircraft operating in uncontested airspace. The IRGC's ballistic missiles continue to launch, but against a carrier strike group air defense network that is interceding at rates the IRGC's own launch volume cannot overcome. The 3-night target total of more than 300 is not a ceiling. CENTCOM has established through 4 consecutive operational windows that each package will be larger than the previous one. The campaign is still ascending. The economic track has severed or disrupted every supply chain input that the IRGC's operational capacity depends on. The rail bridge connecting the Iranian military resupply corridor to China has been destroyed. The petrochemical refinery in Loristan province that produced chemical inputs for ballistic missile and drone manufacturing has been destroyed by covert ground sabotage that left no external fingerprint. Port infrastructure across the entire southern coastline has been struck in successive operational windows. Power plants in the south have been hit, producing confirmed regional outages. The naval blockade constrains the maritime trade channels that sanctions pressure had not already closed. And the daily Iranian ballistic missile launch rate has declined to approximately a dozen per day. An inventory constraint reflecting weeks of consumption against targets the IRGC cannot damage at a rate that changes the operational balance, while the production and resupply pipelines that would regenerate that inventory have been systematically eliminated. The psychological track is producing effects across every audience layer simultaneously in ways that compound each other. Inside Iran, 50,000 protesters killed by the Iranian government in the months preceding this conflict's current phase represents a population that watched its own government massacre citizens who took to the streets to express what the burning IRGC facilities and the power outages and the blocked port cities confirm operationally, that the organization demanding their political compliance and economic sacrifice cannot protect the territory it governs. On the regional level, every Gulf state watching the IRGC's coastal military architecture systematically dismantled across 3 nights, while 800 commercial vessels move through the supposedly closed strait, is absorbing a permanent downward revision of the IRGC's deterrent value, the calculation that has kept Gulf Arab governments carefully balancing their relationships with both Iran and the United States for decades. On the international level, 400 million barrels of crude oil moving through a waterway that the IRGC declared closed is a real-time economic refutation of every claim Iran has made about its control of the most important energy shipping corridor on Earth. Go inside the IRGC command structure as it actually functions under the pressure of 3 consecutive nights of 100-plus target strikes, because the public statements from Kalibaf and the IRGC's spokesperson provide a systematically misleading picture of the actual decision-making environment. The organization is not making coherent, strategic decisions from a position of intact command authority. It is executing pre-programmed operational protocols through a command and control infrastructure that loses coherence with each successive night of strikes against its communications and coordination systems. Local commanders south of destroyed communications nodes are making autonomous decisions with incomplete information, using whatever launch capability remains in their immediate area without reliable contact with the chain of command above them. The ballistic missiles being fired, in small, sequential, geographically dispersed salvos, rather than the mass saturation simultaneous launches that would present the most complex intercept challenge to American air defense, are the operational signature of exactly that degraded, fragmented command environment. They are not a coordinated retaliatory strategy. They are the outputs of individual launch crews executing the authorization they arrived with, firing when the opportunity presents itself without the overarching coordination that would make the launches constitute a militarily coherent response. The real strategic objective the IRGC has been pursuing throughout this conflict, the one that explains both the Memorandum of Understanding and the immediate decision to violate it, is not the denial of commercial navigation to any specific nation or the punishment of any specific adversary. It is the establishment of permanent legal and operational authority over the Strait of Hormuz as a post-conflict condition. A formal international recognition that Iranian forces have the right to identify, monitor, and authorize vessel transit through the waterway. A toll booth not just on oil flows, but on the entire architecture of global energy security, backed by the threat of IRGC military force against any vessel or nation that challenges Iranian maritime sovereignty in the corridor. The Memorandum of Understanding was Iran's attempt to codify that authority in writing, the language about Iran facilitating safe passage through its best efforts being carefully chosen to establish the principle of Iranian authorization as a precondition for transit. The immediate violation of the MOU was the test of whether the American administration would enforce the terms or accommodate the violation to preserve the diplomatic framework. The 300 confirmed targets and the continued flow of 800 commercial vessels through the supposedly closed strait is the definitive answer. There is a new operating principle in the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC does not control it, and CENTCOM will keep demonstrating that reality with every successive strike package until the demonstration is no longer required or the IRGC's capacity to challenge it no longer exists. Iran declared the strait closed and posted the MOU as justification, while CENTCOM was executing Strike Package 3 against 140 targets. The IRGC said the era of one-sided deals was over. It was right about that. The era of the IRGC extracting one-sided operational advantages from diplomatic frameworks it has no intention of honoring is what is actually over. The era of tolerating an organization that attacks unarmed civilian ships and calls it maritime safety enforcement is over. The era of messaging and graduated responses that gave the IRGC room to read restraint as weakness and probe for the next threshold it could cross without triggering overwhelming force is over. What replaced that era is visible in the target counts. 80 targets, 90 targets, 140 targets, 300 total, 800 ships through the strait, 400 million barrels of crude to market. The math is not ambiguous, and it is not going in Iran's preferred direction. The strait is open. The targets are burning. And CENTCOM has not yet announced what comes next, which is itself the most important thing to understand about where this conflict stands. Because in this campaign, what comes next has consistently been larger than what just happened. And 300 targets in 3 nights has not found its ceiling.